Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There have been more echoes this evening of the dark days and nights of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. A bus was set alight in the latest outbreak of violence in West Belfast. Members of the Northern Ireland Assembly are due to meet in the morning, called back from their Easter break to work out what to do. Loyalist groups are angry about two things, mainly the failure to prosecute 24 members of Sinn Féin for breaking COVID rules by attending a large funeral, and the post-Brexit border checks on goods lorries from Great Britain.
Violence on the streets of Belfast tonight, where the perpetrators were brazen enough to hijack a bus and set it alight. These the latest frightening scenes in a Northern Irish Easter blighted by unrest. 41 police officers have been injured in the disorder in recent days, at a time when the decisions of their commanders have been under intense scrutiny.
Calls for the chief constable to resign by unionist politicians, demands for his senior leadership team to go, and claims that they no longer have the respect and support of the community have been incredibly damaging to the overall impact on policing and justice, and has made the police, I think, something of a lightning rod for people's wider anger and frustration.
The First Minister of Northern Ireland has condemned the violence, but Arlene Foster has also led those calls for Northern Ireland's police chief to resign after a decision not to prosecute a number of Sinn Féin politicians who attended the funeral of a former IRA man last summer, a time when lockdown restrictions on large gatherings were in place.
The PSNI failed to prevent that crime taking place. The PSNI failed in many ways to intervene when it was taking place, and they failed to investigate it. So that has confirmed for a lot of people within the unionist and loyalist community that policing is two-tiered, that it's one rule for provisional Sinn Féin and another for everyone else.
An attempt to take the politics out of policing in Northern Ireland was one of the key components of the Good Friday Agreement, now more than 2 decades old. But the peacemakers' plans are being undermined by the unique pressures of the last year. A Brexit agreement which places checks on goods travelling between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK also fuels loyalist feelings of abandonment and isolation. Once again, a community in Northern Ireland feels under threat, and once again, some have chosen violence as their response. Geraint Vincent, News at 10, Belfast.
Police in Northern Ireland say last night's violence in parts of Belfast was the worst they've seen for years. The kind of rioting so many had hoped was a thing of the past. During an emergency session of the Northern Ireland Assembly today, politicians on all sides lined up to condemn the attacks, which have been going on for nearly a week now. The worst of the unrest was in the west of the city, on both sides of a wall between the loyalist and nationalist communities. This report from our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy contains some violent scenes.
On an already febrile situation, now more fuel on the fire. At one of Belfast's peace lines last night, the peace was broken. In the hands of teenagers, petrol bombs thrown in both directions over the wall. Each evening, these gates are locked to keep the mainly Protestant and Catholic communities apart. Now forced open, rammed by cars and battered closed by police, amidst a running battle between crowds on each side.
It's hard to control. Mobs of kids, when they see one side doing it, they're joining in.
Who's encouraging it?
The loyalist politicians are doing it. Why? Because they got Brexit in and it's not working. It'll take months and months now to repair the damages community-wise, if it ever is repaired.
As the fighting continued between Belfast's Shankill and Springfield Road, local priests tried to warn young people of the danger, themselves in harm's way. The to and fro attacks, which lasted over an hour, have just been interrupted by the arrival of this line of police Land Rovers who pushed the crowd back from this side of the peace wall. Earlier, on the other side of the wall in the Loyalist Shankill Road, a bus was hijacked and set alight.
The disorder last night was at a scale that we have not seen in recent years in Belfast or further afield. The fact that it was sectarian violence and there was large groups on both sides of the gates at Lanark Way, again, is something that we have not seen for a number of years.
In Loyalist communities, who are staunchly British, there's a backlash over the Brexit deal, which sets Northern Ireland apart from the rest of the UK.
So whenever I got here, the police...
19-year-old Joel was himself arrested in a riot over Easter and released without charge. He tells me he was looking out for a friend. But many who have become involved are even younger.
Why do you think this is happening?
I don't think young people really understand the details in terms of the Irish sea border and stuff. I think what they're being told and what they're seeing reflected in the media is that Sinn Féin are winning, the Republicans are winning, and that our identity is under attack. And when they hear those words, when they hear that stuff, and then they're told, all right, and the way that you can help is by going out there and throwing bombs, sticks and stones at people, they're more than willing to do so.
People will say, why were you there in the first place? Wouldn't it have been better to just go home?
The fact is, someone I cared about was in trouble, and I don't think that that's anything that someone can sort of blame me for or accuse me of wrongdoing.
As the clean-up operation began in Belfast, political leaders gathered for an emergency meeting at Stormont to try and bring about calm.
There can be no place in our society for violence or the threat of violence, and it must stop.
What we saw last night at Lanark Way interface, I think, was a very dangerous escalation of events of recent days, and it's utterly deplorable.
There's concern the gates have been opened on something more reminiscent of Northern Ireland's days of old, and they may be difficult to close.
And we can join Emma now in Belfast for us. Emma, as I said just now, these are scenes we'd really hoped we'd not see again.
They are, but then again, Belfast is very good at getting back on its feet, and those peace gates you saw there where the worst of the violence was last night, well, they are already being fixed today. But there are protests planned in the days ahead and unauthorised parades where there is the potential for more disorder. Now, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson spoke with the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, today by phone. They agreed that the way forward would be through dialogue. But we have also seen unity on all sides from politicians here in Northern Ireland today when it comes to condemning the violence, but there are still grievances and divisions being played out between the main unionist and nationalist parties, and sometimes it is the blow-for-blow nature of politics here in Northern Ireland which gets reflected on the streets.
Emma, thank you very much.
The Northern Ireland Secretary has held urgent talks with the country's political leaders after Belfast saw some of its worst rioting for years. A bus was hijacked and set alight and police were attacked. It's the 7th night of rioting which has affected several areas. Our correspondent Geraint Vincent witnessed some of the violence in Belfast last night.
Charred remains being swept off the road in Belfast after a night of violence which saw one of the walls which marked this city's sectarian divide breached. The damage was being repaired this morning, while the police described perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the worst rioting they'd seen in years.
What we saw was a mixture of young people and adults, but there were certainly some children present who we would assess as being as young as 13 or 14, who were encouraged and supported by adults who stood by and clapped and cheered.
The trouble started at dusk yesterday when a double-decker bus was hijacked and set alight. Into the night, police were attacked with petrol bombs in a continuation of violence sparked in loyalist areas across the Easter period and which spilled over yesterday into nationalist neighbourhoods. Pleas for calm were ignored in West Belfast tonight, and trouble has flared at the traditional flashpoints, the places where loyalist and nationalist communities intersect. The violence unfolds amid loyalist anger about a Brexit deal which they say cuts them off from the rest of the United Kingdom. Well, the UK's Northern Ireland Secretary arrived in Belfast today for emergency talks with the main political parties here.
The adults are encouraging children to take up activity that's going to damage them for the rest of their lives in terms of their opportunities, at a time where we should be looking at investment and inward investment, an exciting time for Northern Ireland's economy and the opportunities that it has, is beyond dreadful.
The Stormont Assembly was recalled from its Easter recess this morning, and the leaders of Northern Ireland's power-sharing government were agreed on the dangers of young people being recruited into an old conflict.
We cannot allow a new generation of our young people to fall victim to that path or be preyed upon by some who prefer the shadows to the light.
It's only through democratic politics that we can solve our problems and concerns, and call on those organising young people to engage in violence to stop, and to those young people themselves to call on them to exercise restraint.
The message from the politicians has been consistent. Dialogue is the way to settle disputes. But for all the talking that's been done today, there's no sign yet that the violence will stop. And the police also said today that they're sure of two things. One, that members of paramilitary groups were involved in the riot, and two, that the violence was orchestrated. They talked about how you don't get that many petrol bombs made available without some level of organisation. Now, as worrying as that is, it does suggest that if there's somebody capable of organising the violence, then there's somebody capable of bringing it to an end. And it's getting through to that person or people that is the challenge that the politicians face. But in an atmosphere of mistrust right now in Northern Ireland, that's going to be difficult.
OK, Geraint, thank you.
Emergency talks have been taking place in Northern Ireland after yet another night of violence on a scale which police said had not been seen for decades. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, met leaders of the power-sharing executive to discuss the unrest, whilst the Stormont Assembly came together to condemn the violence and to support the rule of law. In last night's clashes, a bus was set on fire and 8 police officers were injured as they came under attack. From Belfast, Porrick O'Brien has this report.
The interface is on fire. A gate in the peace line between Catholic and Protestant neighbourhoods in Lanark Way, West Belfast last night. For a few hours, a time portal. Back to a place where no one who really remembers really wants to go back. The trouble started at about 5 p.m. in the Loyalist Shankill Road end. Hundreds of mainly young people started showing up. Then a flashpoint. The driver of a bus was ordered to get out. There were thankfully no passengers on board. The bus started to roll down the hill. Then this. The crowd then turned on the police. 8 officers were injured in yesterday's disturbance. A total of 55 PSNI officers have now been injured in 6 nights of sporadic localised disquiet in Northern Ireland. So we're here on the Shankill Road. It's about 10 o'clock at night. This is what's left of that bus. Just at the end of this road to our left is Lanark Gate, one of the gates on the peace line. There are about 300 or 400 young people down there. They are throwing petrol bombs up over the wall into the Catholic Republican community on the other side. On the Springfield Road end, crowds also in their hundreds returned rocks and masonry. The gate at Lanark Way normally closes at 10 p.m. Yesterday it was closed earlier, but then prized open. Just to give you an insight into the sort of complexity around policing in Northern Ireland, while that gate remains open, it was like broken open a few hours ago. Police tried to lock it up, but petrol bombs came over the gate and stopped them from doing that. Later today, I imagine the police will arrive. They'll try to bolt up the gate again. Once that happens, things will start to die down and people will disperse. In the crowd last night, Jerry Kelly, Sinn Féin spokesperson for policing and justice.
So how do we move through this? There are issues outside of policing, of course, and they need to be resolved as well. And we're politicians, and together we need to resolve it. But the place to do that is up in the Assembly. It's not to bring people out onto the street and then face what we've faced here for a number of hours here. And there's now, if you watch social media, there's a number of protests which have been planned for Friday and for the next number of days. We do not want another hot summer.
The forecast for a Belfast hot summer is not looking good. There's real anger in sections of the community that there's been no consequences for Sinn Féin's leadership after attending an IRA funeral last year, appearing to breach COVID restrictions. There's been calls for the Chief Constable of the PSNI to resign. There's been local criminal groups stirring up trouble as well. Today, the Northern Irish Assembly was recalled and a chorus of cross-party condemnation of the violence.
The injury to frontline officers, victims terrorised, damage to people's property, the harm to Northern Ireland's image in this, our centenary year, has taken us backwards. And no brick, no bottle, no petrol bomb thrown has achieved or can ever achieve anything but destruction, harm and fear.
These are the people who have to clean up the mess, literally. A local unionist councillor, a clergyman and a youth worker on the Clockfern roundabout, Newton Abbey, where violence broke out at the weekend. The DUP has painted itself into something of a corner around Brexit. They ended up having to own the Northern Irish Protocol, a trading border down the Irish Sea. And for these men, that's the political backdrop to the current spate of violence.
Setting aside the sort of, possible criminal elements to it, what is this about?
Ultimately, my opinion is that it's very much based on Boris's betrayal. I was there when Boris gave a commitment that there would be no border in the Irish Sea.
Maybe it's the cause for a lot of young people to be involved. It's a combination of their identity feeling under attack. They look at their future and they think, is it United Ireland? And if it is, how am I going to be treated in that type of United Ireland? They feel British. They want to remain part of the United Kingdom.
The job of untangling a complicated set of grievances is the longer-term project for political leaders here. Trying to stem the violence tonight and over the weekend, a more immediate concern.
Well, earlier I spoke to Naomi Long of the Alliance Party. She's the Minister of Justice in Northern Ireland in the executive, and I began by asking her if she saw this as a law and order issue or a political problem.
Well, I think it's both. I think that it started as a political problem. It has evolved into a challenge to the rule of law in Northern Ireland. And I think we need to find political solutions in order to actually find resolution. There is no point us engaging in empty condemnation unless we actually deal with the fundamental issues that have driven it in this direction.
What are the fundamental issues?
Well, there are a whole range of issues, John. I mean, we have, for example, people's disaffection around Brexit, how that has worked out. It hasn't been the sunlit uplands in Northern Ireland that they were promised, and I think they feel very much that they have been let down by government. I think people are angry because of Republican funerals and how those have taken place during a time of COVID. And there are a whole host of other issues and disaffection. But I think that particularly at the moment, whilst all of those issues are relevant, I think that at times politicians have failed to show the kind of calm leadership that is required when we face these challenges as part of the wider context. And so it's important, I think, now that as politicians we try to work together and pull together to find solutions to problems rather than simply analysing where the difficulties lie.
But it is clearly a loyalist community issue, is it not? I mean, they obviously feel to some extent sidelined and betrayed. And yet at the same time, a lot of the rioters actually just look like fairly young, not particularly politically motivated characters.
Well, I mean, some of the children, and they are children who have been involved in this, are as young as 12 and 13. The appalling part of it for me is that they are surrounded by adults old enough to be their parents and old enough to know better, who are cheering them on and goading them into engaging in this violence. To me, that is child abuse, pure and simple, and it needs to stop. Undoubtedly, there are issues in communities that need to be addressed, but none of that excuses the violence. And I have to say that those 12-year-olds aren't there because of the finer outworkings of the protocol or because they have issues with the COVID regulations. The issues for those young people are that the community around them are using them as cannon fodder in a battle that they want to fight, and they're often also very vulnerable to malign influence from paramilitary organisations who are dealing drugs in those communities and doing untold harm. The PSNI, our police service here, have been having a lot of success in terms of breaking up some of that paramilitary organisation and some of those criminal gangs. And I think that that is in part too a contributory factor to why they're now using young people as a battering ram against the police.
Finally, Minister, we're about to have better weather. The summer is coming. If this doesn't get resolved before that, we're in for a lot of trouble.
Well, our summers are often long and hot in the worst possible way, and it's rarely to do with the weather. And we don't need to see that again. I mean, I have spoken to people today who have young children who are concerned that they are being exposed to scenes of violence on the news that I hoped children growing up in Northern Ireland would never see again. That was my backdrop growing up. I never wanted another generation to see it. And it's now incumbent on all of us in political leadership and community leadership, working with the police, working with the legal authorities to ensure that we don't end up in that situation, because it is in no one's interest, least of all those communities in which this violence is taking place.
Justice Minister Naomi Long, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Who's at Stormont now? Warwick.
Well, John, as we speak, unfortunately, again, there are large groups of people gathering at Lanark Way, which you saw in my report. They're burning items on the street. So the prospect again, unfortunately, of another violent night in West Belfast. By the way, we've decided to position ourselves here outside Stormont because we've deemed it not safe to do this live there. A journalist was targeted yesterday there, so only imagine what the police are going through. And I make that point because once upon a time you could go even into a volatile situation like that in West Belfast, particularly on the loyal side, and you could identify who the community leaders were. There was an element, strangely, of coherence even in those quite volatile situations. That was absent there yesterday, and I think that also speaks to a broader point. We've been talking to the old guard in the loyalist paramilitaries over the last couple of days, and they talk about a younger generation of people who lacked the discipline, who lacked whatever code they had, who talked to their elders and now say, well, you engaged with the system, you tried, you were let down, now it's our turn. And that is a very, very worrying sentiment to hear.
Porrick O'Brien in Belfast.
Well, we hope to speak in a minute to Billy Hutchinson, leader of the Progressive Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, who before his turn to politics was convicted of murder. But first, Jonathan Powell, who was the chief government negotiator in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Jonathan Powell, thanks for joining us. We are 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. What do you think these scenes say about Northern Ireland today?
Well, I think it's very sad to see these pictures again. We did think this was something that we put behind us. And I do hope the politicians will come together to make sure this isn't a long, hot summer, as John was just predicting it would be.
Do you think that these riots suggest in some way that there are limits to the Good Friday Agreement?
No, I think the Good Friday Agreement has served us very well over the last 20-odd years. I think the initial problem was some criminal elements who were being dealt with by the police using children on the street to start rioting. The problem is it's now taken off in a bigger way. You've got the two communities attacking each other. And you've got politicians, in my view, playing with matches in the middle of a situation that could turn into a really serious conflagration. We're not going to go back to the Troubles, but as these evenings draw out and as these children are on the street and people are egging them on to do these things, we could get into a really serious mess. We need some political leadership. It shouldn't have taken a week for the Prime Minister to issue a tweet on the subject, and a tweet isn't going to fix it. We need the Prime Minister to show some leadership, to work with the Irish government, to bring together all the parties and actually get some common sense and pragmatism into this so we do avoid this kind of trouble going on right through to July.
When you say politicians playing with matches, who are you talking about?
I think some of the politicians in Northern Ireland, for example, calling for the resignation of the Chief Constable right in the middle of all of this is just irresponsible. Of course, the Chief Constable needs to stay there and try and deal with this. The police haven't had to deal with this for some time. They're not as experienced as they were, and they need some firm leadership in this, and people should be supporting the police, not attacking them.
Yeah. The Loyalist Communities Council, which you were involved in setting up, has failed to condemn the violence. What do you make of that?
I hope that they will come out and condemn the violence. I noticed that some Loyalist leaders, including in South Belfast, have done so just today. I believe that some of the members of the LCC are actually going out there and trying to stop some of this violence happening. They're dealing with a community that's feeling very alienated at the moment. They're doing their best to try and stop it. But there must be a reach out to the loyalist community in this. I think turning our backs on the loyalist community would be completely the wrong thing to do. We should offer a political way forward for those loyalists who want to take it. Those who are going to be criminals should be dealt with by the police. But we shouldn't leave the loyalists out of this. They have legitimate reasons to feel aggrieved.
Ultimately, what's clear, though, is paramilitaries, or you may call them criminal gangs, are still wielding huge influence in Northern Ireland. What do you think should be done about that?
As I said, I think we need to deal with this in two different ways. The police should come down hard on some of these young criminal leaders who have been using loyalism as a tool, and they should offer a political way out to these communities who are really very deprived and have been in many ways left behind by the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. We need to reach out to them economically and socially, and we need to offer them a political way forward. And it's people like Billy who can actually go and do that, I think, and I hope that they will.
We'll be speaking to him in a moment, but partly this is about Brexit, and how can that issue be resolved? I mean, is it a question of taking away the Northern Ireland Protocol? Because we've been told there's no alternative.
There is no alternative. One of the communities was always going to be hurt by Brexit, and John Major and Tony Blair pointed this out at the referendum campaign. There has to be a border somewhere. It could be on the island of Ireland, or it could be in the Irish Sea. Boris Johnson in the end decided to put it in the Irish Sea. He then lied about it, misled people, said there wasn't going to be a border there. As that border has now been implemented, unionists understandably felt aggrieved that their desire to remain part of the United Kingdom has been undermined by a border. Now, we can't get rid of that because the protocol is the only solution that we can find. We've got to make the protocol, however, work practically. There needs to be pragmatism between the EU and the British government.
OK, Jonathan Powell, thanks very much. We're going to have to leave it there and turn to Billy Hutchinson now. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Hutchinson. Can I ask you, what's your view on what's going on the streets?
Well, I mean, I think it's very complex. It's a number of issues and problems that exist. From my point of view, I think that we need to get to grips with this. And, from my point of view, the difficulty is that we need to be actually given political leadership. Now, the problem with that is, can we solve some of the problems that exist? And how do we do that? I don't think that any one group or person can do that, but I do think that particularly if unionism got together in terms of the political parties, then maybe we could be putting out messages. There are a number of people who are using Facebook to get these gatherings to happen, and that could be anybody. We don't know who it is, and neither do the people who are.
Well, let me just ask you about that. Who do you think is orchestrating these riots?
Where these are being said. Pardon?
Who do you think is orchestrating these riots and organising the young people?
Well, it's impossible to know who's orchestrating it. I just heard the end of the last conversation. It seems to be that they're blaming loyalists, but that's been the problem right back from the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, I heard Jonathan talking there, but it was his government or his people who were in power at the time, and they acted outside of the talks that was happening inside and done deals with Republicans. And one of the deals that they said was done was that Tony Blair said that he would look after Republicans and the Chief Constable would look after loyalists. That was the start of criminalising loyalists. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm a loyalist politician. I'm a unionist. And I'm not a criminal, and nobody will criminalise me. And I don't care who it is, neither the British government or the Chief Constable. And people need to realise that this has not just happened over the last couple of days, but it's happened over the last lot of years. We need to get back to solving the problems. We live in a divided society, and therefore we need to have politics working. We need to prove to young people that violence doesn't work. But that's very difficult whenever people actually will see that Republicans feel that they're in government. They're in government because people voted for them. And while those people voted for Sinn Féin for whatever reason, they voted for them, they've got a mandate and they're there, and there is nothing we can do with that. What we need to do is to make sure that the unionist politicians are speaking up and getting what people need in loyalist communities.
Billy Hutchinson, you're someone who's gone from violence and paramilitary activity to them being involved in electoral politics yourself. Why are some people in the loyalist community still so politically alienated? Has politics failed them?
Well, I think it's been very difficult. I think the alienation comes from different viewpoints. I think the problem for unionism is that unionism feels that they're behind in terms of what happened during the peace process and what that peace process delivered. And if you ask any of your cameramen or reporters who have been out on the Shankill, they will tell you that it doesn't look like an area that is a gain from the peace process. It's very derelict, it's very run down. So, I think we need to do that. But this is not just about social or economic issues. This is about how people feel. I think that your audience needs to understand that we're part of the United Kingdom, and we can't be treated differently. What has happened is, due to Brexit, and this is an opinion of myself, what happened after Brexit was that we stayed within the European Union. It's undemocratic. We do not have any representatives in the European Parliament. We have no MEPs, and what we're relying on is people who are in a foreign government to represent us as British citizens.
Yeah.
So it's
very quickly,
undemocratic.
sorry to interrupt you.
Say.
Very quickly, apart from Brexit, do you think it's also ultimately about the loyalist community facing an existential crisis, whether that's the demographic changes or young people no longer identifying with a sectarian identity?
Well, I think I'd be very clear here. I would say to unionist people in the community that I represent, I want to be very clear. I'm not a unionist amongst 900,000. I'm a unionist amongst 64 million. And I think that people need to realise that we're British. We live in the United Kingdom, and what we're asking for is the same as what the rest of the United Kingdom get. We're not asking for any difference. And that Northern Ireland's 100 years old this year. And I think that those people in republicanism who claim we're a failed identity, it's gone on for 100 years. And failed.
Point made, Billy Hutchinson. We have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us.
Violence again on the streets of Belfast tonight as police deploy water cannon. As the crisis escalates, the White House's appeal for calm. An emergency meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly was held, and the Northern Ireland Secretary has flown to the city for talks. The reasons for the disturbances are many. Poverty, unemployment and the pandemic all play a part. The attendance of 2,000 mourners at a prominent IRA member's funeral raised tensions, and concerns over the Brexit deal aren't helping either. Remember, Boris Johnson said to Northern Ireland businesses that exporters would not have to fill in customs declarations if they sent goods across the Irish Sea, and to bin declarations if anyone asked them to fill them in. So, 23 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, what is the way forward? Here is our policy editor, Lewis Goodall.
This year, Northern Ireland is 100 years old. It is spending its centenary year, as it has spent so many others, mired in tension. For the sad truth about this corner of the United Kingdom is that the threat of violence, the threat of a return of violence, hangs over us always. And for the last 7 nights now, that threat has been realised.
As political leaders, we must stand united in appealing to
The Assembly met
concerned.
today to denounce what we've seen these last 7 nights. But to understand where these last 7 nights have come from, you have to understand a longer story, one rooted in a crisis in loyalism.
Ever since 1998, there have been elements of loyalism that have been disaffected by what they see as a peace process that has delivered for Republicans, but has largely left them behind. Now, I don't agree with that. I think unionism and loyalism has made many gains out of the 1998 agreement, but there is a perception within loyalism that it's all going in the other direction. Added to that, you have the decision last week, and this is not a judgment by me at all, but the decision by the Public Prosecution Service not to go ahead with prosecutions of leading Sinn Féin figures for alleged breaches of COVID regulations at the funeral of Bobby Storey last year. And so you've got a sort of toxic mix which has kind of all come together at once.
But then add to this chronic sense of inequity the more acute grievance over the Northern Ireland Protocol, the imposition of a border between NI and GB, and you understand why things have deteriorated so quickly. There are other factors, like discontent over police crackdowns on paramilitary gangs, but the big picture is clear. It isn't only about Brexit, but it is impossible to understand without it. In terms of what happens now, Westminster politicians are clear they want a return to the political process. But there are three problems with that. The first relates to the DUP's lessened position in the eyes of many loyalists, the odd balancing act it must now perform, and the tension inherent within it.
The difficulty the DUP have now in relation to the protocol is that whilst they maintain the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive, they have to implement the protocol. So the DUP are stuck in this situation whereby on one hand they're saying that the protocol essentially undermines the very fabric of the Union, which is at the core of our identity, but on the other hand that they're part of an Executive and Assembly which is implementing the protocol. So you can't be an opponent of the protocol and an implementer of the protocol at the same time. And that is why I think that we're naturally going to see political instability, because you probably have different sections of the DUP, more hardline sections of the DUP, who would pull down the institutions tomorrow.
Second, insofar as British governments and British prime ministers have ever been trusted by loyalists, this one is held in especially low stead, not least because of the promises he once made.
I want to make it absolutely clear that under no circumstances, whatever happens, will I allow the EU or anyone else to create any kind of division down the Irish Sea.
And third, the practicalities. Let us, for a moment, suppose that Boris Johnson did as the loyalists would like him to do and jettison the protocol wholesale. Well, what that would do is eviscerate his relationship with the European Union and the Republic. It would likely damage an already enfeebled UK economy and likely also inflame tensions on the other side of the ledger. It's possible that you would have nationalists taking to the streets. The simple fact of the matter is the particular form of Brexit that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson chose has, as predicted, destabilised the politics of Northern Ireland, and there isn't an obvious way of writing it again.
What we need now in relation to the protocol is there are two options basically. One is that the UK seeks a much softer, closer relationship with the EU. Sadly, Boris Johnson looks like he's not going to pursue that. He's going to refuse to do that. I can't see how he will make that move that would be good for the whole UK. The other option is to seek a more constructive relationship with the EU in terms of making the protocol work, addressing individual issues as they come up, and making a joint commitment to making the protocol work for everyone in Northern Ireland.
To make that work, the EU will need to bend as well, something about which we hear far less. But even with every practical step possible, the theory of the new border will endure. That alone may mean discontent endures as well. It would hardly be the first time in Northern Ireland's history that principle mattered most.
Lewis Goodall, well, we invited the government on the programme tonight, but they declined. But I am joined by the Conservative MP, Theresa Villiers, who was Northern Ireland's Secretary for 4 years until 2016 and supported Brexit at the referendum. Good evening, Theresa Villiers.
Good evening.
When you were Northern Ireland's Secretary, you described claims that Brexit would throw up barriers and destabilise the peace process as scaremongering of the worst and most irresponsible kind. Should you eat your words tonight?
I believe that the commitment of the vast majority of people to exclusively peaceful means to determine their future is rock solid. I do not believe that the peace process is in jeopardy. It's a depressing fact that rioting and lawlessness of the kind we've seen on the streets over recent days is something that's disfigured Northern Ireland over decades. We need a robust police response to it, but references back to Brexit are not an excuse for these rioters. Nothing justifies what they're doing.
And of course, Brexit is only part of the problem. But then let's just take you back to what Boris Johnson said. He said to Northern Ireland businessmen on film that if they were to receive customs declarations, they could put them directly in the bin. If you think that what the Prime Minister says matters, that wasn't true. And surely to say that, given what's happened, was a huge error of judgment. And now we see the reality on the ground. Surely the Prime Minister has to stand by his words, repeated more than once, and they've been found not to be true.
Well, the Prime Minister and Lord Frost are doing everything they can to make the protocol work. It was a difficult compromise.
They made a promise.
Have to agree.
They made a promise that if you got a customs declaration as a Northern Ireland business person, you could put it in the bin. It would mean nothing. Was that wrong? to do that?
And what they're doing now is to try to find a way to deal with the frictions which have arisen under the protocol. The problem is particularly acute in relation to food, but there are solutions. An obvious one is the protocol already provides that if your goods are not at risk of going into the single market, i.e. down south, then customs formalities don't apply in the same way. They just need to apply that principle to food-related checks, which would be an entirely proportionate approach, a risk-based approach, because we have some of the highest food safety standards in the world. There is no need for the excessive paperwork that the EU wants to impose.
But the fact is that but the fact is a border does exist. Last month, though, you said now the protocol does have potential to create serious political instability. You recognise that as a former Northern Ireland Secretary. You recognise that it had the potential to create serious political instability.
It does, yes. I'm not understating the problems caused by the protocol. In the longer term, I want to see it replaced altogether so that we no longer have a situation where Northern Ireland is stuck in single market rules without a say over them.
So you want a reworking of the you like a reworking of the deal on Northern Ireland.
Yes, but I accept that that's unlikely to happen in the short term, which is why we need to negotiate the fixes to deal with the worst of the frictions. And I believe they are deliverable, not least because when it comes to food and other border-related checks, the EU is under an obligation to take a proportionate approach, an evidence-based approach, which they're not in imposing the full panoply of SPS checks on food going into Northern Ireland from Great Britain.
Well, let's look at the broader picture in Northern Ireland. And today, the moderator of the Presbyterian Church said, and this is across Northern Ireland, there is a growing sense of hopelessness, a lack of economic progress, reduced opportunity for employment, and educational disadvantage. In a way, politics has entirely failed Northern Ireland.
Well, Northern Ireland has progressed massively in the 2 decades since the Belfast Agreement. Huge progress has been made. There's been a lot of economic success. Clearly, the COVID disaster will have had a huge impact. But clearly there is much work to be done to build resilience in the communities where we're seeing this rioting take place, and to break the hold that these criminal gangs that label themselves as loyalist paramilitaries, to break the hold they have over these communities, because that influence is part of the problems we're seeing manifested on the streets at the moment.
But the other fundamental problem, and we see it, and we've seen it over the last 7 days, I just take you to, it's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in 2 years' time. And the deal was, under the Good Friday Agreement, the target was to remove the peace walls. The peace walls, if anything, are even more entrenched than they were. The peace walls have been pushed forward and pushed back and put up again tonight. Do you actually think the peace walls are going to come down in the next 2 years? Do you?
No, I don't think they'll come down in the next 2 years. It's sadly the case that these communities want, in many cases, these interface barriers to stay up. But I fully agree that there is much more work to be done to build a genuinely shared society and break down sectarian divisions. They've never gone away, but we shouldn't lose sight of the tremendous success that's been delivered by the devolved settlement agreed under the Good Friday Agreement. It has created huge new opportunities for Northern Ireland. It's transformed life for the better.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight, Theresa Villiers. Well, of the 10 people arrested in recent days, some were as young as 13. So what's led to this? I'm joined now by Maria Cahill, a former SDLP politician and political commentator from a nationalist background, and Andrew McCormick, a community worker in the unionist areas of East Belfast. Good evening to both of you. Maria Cahill, tell me where you think the deepest problems over integration lie.
I think we have a number of problems, and I think part of the interview there that you did with Theresa Villiers actually explains it a bit, because while she's pontificating around the protocol, part of Belfast is burning tonight, and it is mostly young children, as you say, who are involved in it. And I think part of the difficulty that we have is to try and ensure that that cycle of sectarianism isn't exacerbated through a political failure here. And one of the difficulties is that those children, I mean, to quote W.B. Yeats, peace has come dropping slow for them because they are caught in a cycle. Some of them are third generation unemployed. They're living in an area of multiple deprivation. In fact, the area that you see a lot of the rioting on over the last 2 nights, for example, the Springfield and the Shankill, it ranks #1 in an area of multiple deprivation in terms of educational skills and in unemployment. So what we need to do, and I think everybody in Northern Ireland has a responsibility in this, is to look collectively at a strategy from birth right through possibly 20-year strategy in terms of wraparound services so that we can start to deal with those problems of poverty and exclusion and also aggression, because we have a cycle of aggression in this society too. And every time there is a political vacuum, this gets exacerbated. And in terms of integration, Kirsty, you know, it is a huge problem. I mean, the fact that we have peace walls still almost 25 years in to this peace agreement would indicate to you that there's a serious problem here.
Andrew McCormick, do you think this is spontaneous anger, or do you think it's been coerced and exploited by different groups? I mean, these are kids as young as 13.
Yeah, Kirsty, no one wants to see what we're currently seeing, but we need to understand that these issues have been simmering for nearly 20 years, and anyone who are surprised by the images that we have seen over the past week are only surprised because they have repeatedly failed to listen to the concerns of the unionist and loyalist community. And while the ink was still wet on the Belfast Agreement or the Good Friday Agreement, there's been a concreted effort to subdue the loyalist community. And the community has been vilified. They have been demonised at every opportunity. And a big thing of the Belfast Agreement was Strand 15D. And this is not just a clause or a mechanism that we talk about, but this essentially is a promise. And this was a promise that was made by all, that no key decisions for Northern Ireland will be made without the consent of the other community. It was a promise to always listen to each other, and that we will not ever return to simple majority where the majority rules the day. It was a promise to always to listen, but this promise has been broken. It's been broken time and time again, to the point where the question is not why are loyalists dropping their support for the agreement. The question should be is why would loyalists support this agreement now in its current form?
So, but in a way, what you've got is you saying, why would loyalists support this agreement in its current form? And you've also the nationalists, the majority of whom voted for Remain, saying, why should we support it either? So, in a sense, nobody is happy in Northern Ireland. The ones that are really suffering from this are children. And so, what do you think, Andrew, is the best way to get children over the sectarian divide?
Well, the best way forward has to be engaging these young people, first of all, in education, because as Maria rightly points out, the educational underachievement, and especially in loyalist and working class areas right across Northern Ireland, is of the worst in the entirety of the United Kingdom. So we need to look at education. We need to get these young people involved in education. We need to get them more GCSEs and more A-levels to improve the job opportunities that are out there. And second of all, we need to get them involved in politicising. We need to politicise.
Well, let me continue before we talk about politicising. Well, let's talk about what was Maria, and you'll remember this title, the Cohesion, Sharing and Integration document, that every child in Northern Ireland was going to be paired with a child from another community. Every child. That was part of the deal. What happened?
Well, it didn't work because people didn't want it to work. And I think it's very dangerous to talk around, you know, what should we do just within the loyalist community. There's rioting on both sides of the peace line tonight. And in terms of children, the exploitation of children over the last week has been an absolute disgrace. In some cases, adults are sending them out to riot, and in other cases, they're standing back and watching them. And what we need to do, why would a young person believe that they have a future here in Northern Ireland when all we do as adults is bicker and fight among ourselves? And I know that sounds very twee to say, Kirsty, but it's actually really important.
And I wonder, Maria,
valued.
I wonder, Maria, you know, what we see in the streets tonight, it only takes a stray firework. It only takes, you know, a petrol bomb for a child to be killed. So presumably de-escalation as soon as possible has got to be the goal.
Absolutely, and I note with regret that the Loyalist Community Council, which is the paramilitary umbrella group that engages and negotiates in some cases with the British government and with the Northern Irish and the NIO, have actually failed to condemn this at all. And I think it's incumbent upon them, if they really, really care about children in their community and having a better future, they need to join the rest of us in terms of condemning it.
And Andrew McCormick, how do you get over to families in loyalist areas that their children are actually in danger? And that's the first part of the question. But secondly, a future in Northern Ireland where all politics is not delineated along sectarian lines would surely be a good one.
Yeah, there's lots of things that I would love to change about this country, and you know, it must be said that I would love nothing more than to see peace progress. But currently, there's massive political and cultural alienation, and I'm not condoning or justifying the behaviour of young people engaged in riotous behaviour. Quite the opposite. But part of the problem is that they've watched and learned that violence or the threat of it has often paid off. And we need not to demonise, but to humanise these young people. We need to see the anger and the deep hurt that these young people are experiencing. And historically, they have watched parades rerouted or stopped because of violent protest or fear.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there because we could definitely do this for another 10 minutes. But thank you very much indeed.